Welcome everybody, and thank you for coming tonight to the 7th Tom Spurling Oration. My name's Beth Webster and I'm the Director of the Centre for Transformative Innovation. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Professor Ashish Arora's talk on science specialisation and the US ecosystem. Before we start, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nation, and also pay respects to all Aboriginal community elders, past, present, who've resided in this area and been an integral part of the history of this region. Today we'll be hearing from our Chief Scientist, Swinburne's Chief Scientist, Professor Virginia Kilbourne, followed by Tom Spurling, who'll say a few words of introduction about the speakers and about the oration itself. And then following that, we'll hear from our keynote speaker, Professor Ashish Arora, and the discussant, Mr. Michael Edwards from Boeing Research and Technology. Before we start tonight, could I ask that you put your mobile devices on silent? And if you wish to share this evening's presentation with X or Twitter, the hash Tom Spurling Oration is the one to use. So can I please invite Professor Kilbourne to the lectern.
Thanks, Beth. And I'd also like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather. So good evening to you all. I'd like to extend an especially warm welcome to our distinguished guest and speaker, Professor Ashish Arora. I'm really looking forward to your talk today. Thank you. Tonight's event is hosted by Swinburne's Centre for Transformative Innovation, a centre dedicated to improving Australia's innovative capacity. Swinburne has a vision to be Australia's leading university in science, innovation and technology. Innovation and technology is embedded in everything we do at Swinburne, across our courses, technology, our campuses and of course our research. One of the driving forces of innovation at Swinburne is Professor Tom Spurling himself. Professor Spurling's contribution to the advancement of science and innovation spans over 55 years. Among his many impressive career highlights and achievements, Professor Spurling is perhaps best known for his role in developing and commercialising the polymer banknote, an innovative and more secure, durable and cost-effective alternative to the paper note. Polymer technology is now used in more than 30 countries. In 2017, Professor Spurling was awarded the prestigious Australian and New Zealand Association for the Advancement of Science Medal. This medal is awarded for contributions to science which lie beyond the normal professional activities. I believe the phrase beyond normal professional activities sums up Professor Spurling's approach to his work well. I'm privileged to be colleagues at Swinburne with Professor Spurling and have seen how he is driven by a true passion for science, technology and innovation. One of these passions is the history of science and innovation in Australia. He's currently working on a project to write the history of CSIRO, Australia's national science agency, dedicated to solving some of our greatest challenges through science and innovation. And what better person than Professor Spurling, whose own history with CSIRO dates back to 1970s. So we're very fortunate to have Professor Spurling at Swinburne to share his expertise in science, innovation and commercialising and translating research. This oration is an opportunity for us to celebrate his many achievements. In a moment, you will hear Professor Arora deliver tonight's oration. Ashish Arora is the Senior Associate Dean for Strategy and Rex D. Adams Professor of Business Administration at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. His research focuses on the economics of technology and technical change. Arora's research has included the study of technology-intensive industries such as software, biotechnology and chemicals, the economics of information security, and the role of patents and licensing in promoting technology startups. He studied the rise of the software industry and the pharmaceutical industry in emerging economies. His current research focuses on the management of intellectual property and licensing in corporations and innovation-based entrepreneurship. Arora has taught a variety of courses, including economics of information, security and risk management. He currently teaches entrepreneurial strategy for innovation-based ventures and emerging market strategy. He serves as departmental editor for management science, served as an editor for research policy between 2008 and 2014, and is on the editorial board of numerous journals, including the National Academy of Sciences and the Association for Computing Machinery. Arora received his PhD in economics from Stanford University in 1992 and was on the faculty at the Heinz School, Carnegie Mellon University, where he held the H. John Heinz Professorship until 2009. He served as a visiting professor at the Scuola Santa Anna Pisa, the Bocconi University Milan and Indian School of Business Hyderabad. This makes him very well placed to speak tonight about science, specialisation and the American ecosystem and the lessons we can learn in this area. Following Professor Arora, Mr. Michael Edwards from Boeing will join the discussion. I'll now hand over to Professor Spurling, who'd like to say a few words before our guests begin. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Virginia, for those generous words. And thanks very much also to Professor Nikki Ragg, who's here, who's the Dean of the School of Business Law and Entrepreneurship. Thank you for your support of this oration and for being here tonight. It's a great honour to have an oration named after you. And I'd like to thank Beth Webster for suggesting this in 2017 and keeping this going for this, as she said, this is the 7th year. You probably read that Virginia has told you who our lecturer is tonight, and that he comes from the Fuqua School of Fuqua Business School at Duke University. I looked, this is an interesting name. I looked up the origin of this name, and John B. Fuqua was a very successful US businessman who donated money to Duke University. He chose Duke because as an adolescent living on a farm in Virginia, he educated himself by requesting books from Duke University Library to be mailed to his farm, and he credited this Duke's lending program with enabling him to learn about business practices and business techniques. And he gave very generously to Duke University because of the generosity of the university itself to him. You probably know that George Swinburne was also a very successful businessman. He didn't borrow books from the Swinburne Library because Swinburne didn't exist at that time, but he did see the need in 1908 to establish the Eastern Suburbs Technical College in Hawthorne, and he gave about what is equivalent to now about $30,000 to set up this this school, and the college evolved to become the Swinburne University of Technology, and I think it was named after him in the 1920s. So Swinburne is the only public university in Australia to be named after its founder, and I thought there was a good connection between Swinburne and John B. Fuqua. Ashish is going to talk to us tonight about some aspects of the US innovation ecosystem, which, as we know, is very well supported both by the government and by private entities, and he's going to talk about some effects of government research funding on private funding. So the US spends about 2.9% of its GDP on R&D, with the government contributing only about 23% of that. We in Australia have had a very long interest in looking at the US innovation system. As has been said, our group has been looking at the history of particularly CSIR and CSIRO. So we looked at the beginning of all of this, and The Commonwealth of Australia began on the 1st of January 1901. Parliament met for the first time in the 9th of May 1901 for ceremonial purposes, and for parliamentary business on the 21st of May 1901. But on the 28th of June, very quickly into this parliamentary session, Sir John Quick, who was the member for Bendigo, introduced a private member's bill which said that in the opinion of this House, a National Department of Agriculture and Productive Industries on the same lines as that of the United States of America be organised and maintained in connection with the government of the Commonwealth. So he looked at the US innovation system in the late 19th century and thought that it'd be a good idea if we copied the US in that. The bill was his bill was very widely supported, but no action was taken until 1916, when Prime Minister Hughes formed and very lightly funded the Commonwealth Advisory Council on Science and Industry. This became the Institute of Science and Industry in 1918, still with very inadequate funding, but was reborn in 1926 as the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research with a sound structure and quite good funding. The pattern was set then for government spending on R&D. This pattern was set very early in our history, and at that time there were very few policies or drive to encourage private spending on R&D. So we've never had adequate private spending on R&D in this country. We spent, in 2017, which is the latest figures I could find, we spent 1.79% of our GDP on R&D, with the government contributing 42% of that total, compared to 23% in the US. So we're very interested to hear what Ashish has got to say about the state of the US innovation system in the 21st century. I'd just like to end by saying that the land we now call Australia has had an innovation ecosystem for a long time. There's evidence that the people of the something like 250 First Nations developed a system that was reflective, inventive and conservative. It related to the need to trade between the various nations, and it was facilitated by a very complicated information exchange network that connected around the country. We in our centre started to document this to include in our Encyclopedia of Australian Science and Innovation, and I'm very glad to see that Professor Gavin McCarthy is here tonight and would be interested in talking to anybody who's interested in this topic. So thank you once again for coming, and thank you, Ashish, for making the journey to the southern part of the world. Thank you.
I'd now like to invite Professor Ashish Arora up to deliver his oration. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm very grateful to Professor Beth Webster and the Centre for Transformative Innovation at Swinburne University, and to all of you for a very, very warm welcome. It's been wonderful. It is an honor, and I should say an unexpected pleasure, to give this oration named in honor of Tom Spurling, partly because one of the first industries I studied when I started my PhD was chemicals, and in particular polymers. And so it's been a wonderful, wonderful coincidence. When I started my PhD, let me just get this clicking on. Cool, all right. When I started my PhD studies in economics at Stanford University in the mid-1980s, the economics of innovation and technical change was a backwater. Now, economists had accepted that technical progress was the source of productivity growth and economic prosperity, In fact, Simon Kuznets, who got a Nobel Prize in economics, said, and I quote, "The epochal innovation that distinguishes the modern economic epoch is the extended application of science to the problems of economic production." Despite this, economists paid very little attention to the economic analysis of how science was applied to the problem of economic production. Fortunately for me, my advisor, the late Professor Nathan Rosenberg, was not one of them. And this was a happy coincidence or a happy accident, because this was also the time when the American innovation system was in the midst of far-reaching changes, which I'll describe. Today, this belief that the application of science and technology is the basis for productivity growth and economic prosperity, and that therefore investments in R&D are the best way to raise living standards, is being called into question. The problem, if you like, is that the measured increases in economic prosperity appear to have slowed down over the last 50 years or so, even as investments in R&D have continued to increase. Today, this evening, I shall attempt to convince you that the slower growth in productivity in economic prosperity does not reflect the reluctance of nature to give up her secrets, but rather it reflects something about how we're organizing this process of discovering and applying knowledge. That is, the problem is not that innovation is becoming more difficult. It's not becoming harder to make new discoveries or to find economic applications for them. Rather, that there is now a division of labor in innovation, and that there is in part a mismatch between the resources that are being invested and the benefits that are resulting from it. Concretely, in America, universities are charged with advancing science, and corporate labs that used to be an important part of this process are in decline. And therefore, we need to find ways to bridge, to connect these two better. And I shall go into this in more detail. Before I begin, there are two caveats. One, I have little to say on the problem of the measurement of productivity or of economic prosperity. This is a thorny problem, particularly in a world where a lot of what we produce is intangible. I'm just going to take it as given that my colleagues are right, that productivity growth indeed has not been what it used to be. Second, the second caveat is that my remarks today are about the American experience. We can discuss the extent to which this generalizes to other countries. Right. So what is the problem? What is the malady? Let me describe the symptoms. Professor Robert Gordon at Northwestern published a book recently called The Rise and Fall of American Economic Growth. Gordon argues that American living standards have improved more slowly since the 1970s as compared to the 50 years before 1920 to 1970. Now, he uses as a measure of improvements in living standards something called total factor productivity. This is a measure the economists use, and the way to think about it is you think about how much economic growth has taken place, and you strip out, you net out the increments of labor and capital and other resources, and what's left over, that's, if you like, the gain that we've had from technical change. And so it's an article of faith among economists that ultimately total factor productivity growth comes from technical progress, from advancements in science and technology, or to go back to Simon Kuznets's more felicitous phrase, upon the extended application of science to the problem of economic production. The issue, of course, is, oh, I beg your pardon. Oops. Now, if you look at this exhibit, those bars show you what's been happening to total factor productivity, and you can see, they haven't reached the heights that they used to have. Those lines tell you something about the investments we've made in science and technology. And the top line is, if I can read this correctly, the top line is research expenditures in constant dollars, and the line below is the production of science and engineering PhDs. This is all American data. So here, this in a nutshell is the problem. We seem to be getting less for our investments, and this is over roughly a 50-year period. So it's not about temporary changes. Now, there are at least two diagnoses that follow from these symptoms. One is that technical and scientific progress has slowed. Robert Gordon himself ends his book on a pessimistic note, saying that the century, the 1870 to 1970 period, was an extraordinary period, unlikely to be repeated. But this pessimism is widespread. Just 6 months ago, the Academy of Management organized a plenary session titled "The End of Innovation." There are papers now published on similar topic. If indeed scientific progress has slowed, then the logical remedy for this is to then think about how to accelerate it, maybe spend more money, maybe reorganize how we organize scientific research. And indeed, if you look at America, there are a number of such efforts underway of how to fund new ways to fund research and to organize research. A lot of it is funded by private philanthropy, which is a tradition in America, as Tom described, and this is all to the good. I, however, I'm going to argue for a different diagnosis of the problem, namely that the problem is not that scientific progress is slowed, is that the way we're connecting it to the economic application is where the problem lies. The implication, therefore, well, first, these two diagnoses of the problem are not, of course, mutually exclusive, right? Both could exist. It's just that the second, I'm going to argue for the second one because it has implications for how we deal with it. So this is a piece of evidence for the first hypothesis. This is a paper published in Nature that attracted a great deal of attention. The point of the paper is that scientific discoveries are increasingly becoming incremental. You see those downward sloping graphs? On the vertical axis is some measure of how disruptive or breakthrough the discovery is. And the second graph is about patents. So both scientific and technical progress in this view are becoming more incremental, fewer breakthroughs. One way to summarize this is that ideas are becoming harder to find, or that we've sort of harvested all the low-hanging fruit, and it's going to be increasingly harder to make discoveries. Perhaps because knowledge, the burden of knowledge is so great. Now, there are two problems with this diagnosis and with the evidence. First, the same paper, in fact, shows that while the share of new novel papers and patents may have declined, the absolute number of such discoveries or such papers has not. And so if you look at the kind of the reddish line there, brown line, that's the number of disruptive papers, and there is no downward trend in that. So even by the evidence provided by the same authors, there is no evidence to support the idea that ideas are becoming harder to find. The second problem is a conceptual one. I'm trained in economics, and so when I see this and we see this evidence that Tom also referred to, let me put it to you like this. If ideas are becoming so harder to find, why are we trying so hard to find them? Simple economics teaches us when the cost of an activity goes up, one should expect to see less of that activity. If something is becoming more expensive, we should do less of it, not more of it. In this exhibit, you see that the absolute quantum in constant dollars of privately funded R&D has steadily increased. Moreover, its share in total US R&D has also increased, going up from about 50% in the 1970s to nearly 70% by 2019. If indeed ideas were becoming harder to find, why would private for-profit companies be spending more money to find them? Unless the private returns to R&D have not fallen, right? Now, that leads to the next problem. If private returns have not fallen, why is it that we're not seeing the productivity benefits in the GDP statistics? And that's what I want to turn to next. Now, the first thing to note is that even though business R&D has gone up substantially and steadily, most of this is now D. We think of R&D as one word. In fact, it's two. There's research and development. And most of this increase that you see is D. In fact, I will show you that the share of D in corporate R&D has also increased over this time. Let me make this more concrete to you. Amazon, the company we all know and love, reported that it spent 42 billion in R&D last year, 42 billion. They don't, of course, report what they do. If you look at that 10 cases, the 300-word description of where these $42 billion went. One conclusion to be drawn, perhaps it's a bit unfair, that most of it is to make small tweaks to their existing goods and products and services, not dramatic improvements or new discoveries. If you like, the software engineer who's finding a new place to put a button or to change the shape of that button is being counted, his or her salary is being counted as part of the D in this R&D of 42 billion. It's not surprising that the two trends that I've described, increasing private investment in R&D and no acceleration in TFP growth, can both coexist. The private returns are high, the social returns, the social benefits have not increased. Now, this was not always the case. Corporate R&D in the past yielded very significant advances: nylon, color television, transistor, personal computer, networking. I would suggest to you that part of the answer for this apparent mismatch lies there. So what happened? How did we get here? Let me just quickly run through the key elements of the story. Globalization and market growth have made even incremental innovation profitable. Simultaneously, the growth of university research has meant that universities now offer an alternative source of scientific research. Startups and spin-offs arise to explore the commercial economic applications of this research. Established corporations, rationally from their point of view, have pulled back from R and focused on D. One way I would describe this as an economist is that there is a growing division of innovative labor that involves universities, startups. If you see that three-legged stool there, that's the innovative division, the division of innovative labor. The creation that involves universities, startups, and established corporations. And this is how the creation and application of science to the problem of economic production is taking place. Now, I'm going to argue about problems with this, but let me underline, there is a good reason this division of innovative labor has taken place. It's based on difference of comparative advantage of which type of organization is more efficient. And there are lots of benefits. And just to make the point, I've given you the example of the COVID-19 vaccine. That was a direct fruit of this division of innovative labor. Now, in the time I have remaining, I'm going to explore some of these points and point out why I think this system that we have, efficient though it is leading to some problems. So just to recap, why is there more private R&D? Well, because the returns to innovation, particularly incremental innovation, have gone up. Why is there this more D? Well, one reason companies can pull back is because other entities in the system, universities and startups, are doing some of what they used to do inside corporate labs for them. Oops. This is sort of systematic evidence that I promised. On the left is the share of basic and applied research in business-funded R&D. These are National Science Foundation data. And you can see at its peak, it was about 40%. The R of R&D was about 40% in corporate research. It's about down to less than a quarter, about 22%. This chart on the right, to your right, gives you the same information using different indicators. If you look at the solid line, that's patents normalized by sales. That's flat, steady. The dotted line is scientific publications. You can think of that as an indicator of scientific research inside corporations, and that has steadily tended down. To give you another example, and I cleared it with Michael before I said this, when I flew over to Australia in a Boeing 777, which was first launched in 1994, so 30 years. I flew from my home in North Carolina to San Francisco in a 737, which was launched more than half a century ago. Now, I say this without intending any disrespect to the airlines or the aircraft manufacturers. The planes that transported us, my wife and I, to Australia, they're far more efficient, fuel efficient in particular, from the original models, the original prototypes. And it's a testament to the ingenuity of the designers and the engineers. Nonetheless, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to look for why 1% TFP growth and not 2% as it used to be, this is a data point. We're still flying 50-year-old designs effectively. Now, the other part of this division of labor is that the R of R&D is being done by universities, funded by the government. In principle, this should be a good thing. Right? Universities are where creative juices flow, where people follow their curiosities. The problem is that the established corporations, where the bulk of the commercialization, the application is taking place, are unable to use what the universities produce. I'm going to skip this one, get to this chart. Now, if you look at what this chart shows is, if you look at the part to the left, that shows you the response of corporate innovation measured many different ways. Total R&D spending, patents, and papers in response to a 10% increase in scientific output from universities. And the takeaway here is how small and tiny the bars are. There appears to be almost no response. Now, they do respond to the production of human capital, PhDs, and that's the second part. But if you thought that the key source of economic growth, which is the creation of new ideas, that appears to elicit no response. One reason is because these ideas, of course, are inchoate, that they're new. But the other reason, the other part of it is companies have lost the ability to absorb what they used to be able to absorb from universities. Right? So this division of labor, while in principle of using greater efficiency, is creating a problem. It appears instead that instead of building on scientific discoveries from universities, established corporations are relying on startups, and in some cases the universities themselves, to translate and develop these scientific advances into economically useful knowledge. Established firms now account for less than a quarter of the licenses given by universities in America. Small firms and startups account for the remaining 3/4. By implication, it is startups that have the job of exploring the commercial application of science. This is a far cry from the glory days of corporate research, which, by the way, perhaps coincidentally, coincide with the period of 2% TFP growth, those high bars that in the first view graph I showed you. What this chart shows is two things. One, these are 8 of the 14 Nobel laureates got Nobel Prizes for the work they did while working for-profit corporations in America. Second, if you look at the logos of these companies, two things should strike you. One, they're all out of the research business, with the possible exception of IBM. In some cases, they're out of business completely. They no longer exist. But they're almost all, with one possible exception, out of the research business. And they all, at one point, had flourishing corporate labs and a proud tradition of both creating science and applying it. Now, my children are not here, but I was thinking of them as I was preparing my remarks, and I said, I don't want to sound like an aging boomer, lamenting the loss of the old. Much of my professional career, in fact, has been in documenting and analyzing this division of innovative labor, which has indeed brought through many benefits. I showed you the example of the COVID-19 vaccine, breakthroughs in mRNA, which were in a university, and the development of the lipid nanoparticle technology, which was vital for the effective use of mRNA, also in startups. Funded initially by the government, later by private capital to develop it further, and then commercialized by companies like Pfizer. This is, if you like, the poster child for when this division of innovative labor works, and it works wonderfully. However, over the last few years, I've become increasingly convinced that there are important gaps that this system is leaving. And that I'll point to two kinds. One is the kind of innovation, and certain types of innovation that I think are getting missed out. And the second is the direction of technical change. There are sectors and fields, if you want to think new materials, energy, climate, deep tech more generally, which are being neglected in favor of digital and life sciences. And so if you look at that chart here, that tells you where VC funding for startups is going. And the takeaway is going into two big sectors: digital, software, and second, life sciences. Now, many observers have pointed to this pattern, but have drawn the wrong conclusion from it. The conclusion they've drawn is this is a problem of VCs. It's not. It's a problem of how we've organized the system. Right. Let me come back to this. Actually, just some companies still remain engaged in research. And in particular, you can see Microsoft and Google as continuing to invest in internal research. Now, where companies remain engaged in research, they advance both science and technology, benefiting both themselves and society at large. And this is because corporate labs can mobilize large teams from different scientific fields that have access to specialized equipment. The long timescales, the combination of scientific and technical expertise from multiple fields, and the access to manufacturing and market knowledge are very difficult to replicate in this more specialized system with universities and startups. Let me give you an example. I suspect many of us have used Google Translate. If you think about what it took to pull that off, first, you see multidisciplinary statisticians, linguists, computer scientists, database experts. Second, to make this work, to make Google Translate useful, there had to be specialized semiconductor application-specific chips, which were what we now know as TPUs, tensor processing units, which was a new chip designed to handle what this new algorithm that the Google scientists had developed. And of course, we all know this now in the age of AI, big data. So if you take sort of a different example, image recognition. Google had access to a database with 375 million labels for 300 million images. The next best in the university sector was Stanford's ImageNet with about 1 million images. The point being, there are some kinds of innovations that you can only pull off in labs. And make no mistake, Google Translate is both a significant scientific advance as well as a very significant innovation application of that science. What's the takeaway? This division of labor, which is now resulting in many established firms withdrawing from research, focusing on more incremental innovations, which results in lower productivity gains, but reasonably high private profitability. It is also associated with established firms being unable to use the growing volume of scientific knowledge being produced by universities, relying willy-nilly on startups and spin-offs to explore the commercial applications of this knowledge and to make it available when successful to the companies. Where it works, such as in digital and life sciences, spectacular successes. But as I've tried to argue to you, this has left very important gaps. All right. So what is to be done? I've described the problem, given you my evidence. Let me start by saying, I don't think corporate labs are coming back. These are shining counterexamples, but research inside a for-profit corporation is always an unnatural activity. So the corporate organism treats it as a foreign body and wants to kill it wherever it's possible. More seriously, if your pension funds were invested in those established corporations, you should take the view, should take a very cold, hard look at whether it's right for this corporation to be managing an enterprise such as long-term scientific research. Even companies that have done it well have found it difficult to sustain the success. Nonetheless, what's true in general is not true for every single firm. And firms such as IBM, Microsoft, and Google continue to make substantial investments. Not surprisingly, these firms have also faced significant government scrutiny about the market dominance. And if you go back to the earlier era, the golden age, GE, IBM, DuPont, Kodak, and Xerox, that were the shining stars in corporate R&D labs, all faced significant government scrutiny about their antitrust practices. AT&T, Bell Labs, was of course a regulated monopoly. Its research investments that Bell Labs made were, in a sense, motivated by the need to justify its continued market dominance. Crudely put, I don't think anybody ever said it quite. This was part of a kind of a social compact, a bargain where AT&T's side of the bargain was that they would invest in Bell Labs, not just to improve their own profits, but also to benefit society. I'm suggesting to you that perhaps it's time to revive this kind of social compact. If we're going to have monopolies or market dominant firms, they perhaps ought to do more good than they're currently doing. And I'm looking at those companies whose lines are flat at the bottom. What this means, of course, I'm not suggesting that we scrap antitrust laws. To the contrary, I'm suggesting we strengthen those laws, but also exercise some forbearance when applying them to firms that are investing in advancing the scientific and technical frontiers. And one reason I think for making this trade-off is if you go back to Google's investments in artificial intelligence, the development of the transformer, which by the way is what ChatGPT uses, OpenAI uses, that advance came from Google, is that one way Google could justify it was the range of applications that it could use this AI technology, from simple things like filtering spam to cooling its data servers, and perhaps eventually aiding autonomous driving technology for its Waymo subsidiary. Tellingly, perhaps, it was much slower to use GPT for search and was pipped to the post by OpenAI, which had less to lose. I'll also remind you, I'm making a very clear distinction between R&D in the R&D. Many market-leading firms, including those guys at the bottom, spend a lot on R&D, just not enough on R. Put very simply, the suggestion is that the forbearance be reserved for the companies that are investing in R, rather than just look at combined R&D. What this means, of course, is we need the stick of antitrust enforcement and the forbearance to be applied judiciously to preserve some of these, the few that we have, and perhaps encourage a few others. Even so, I think this is only going to be a very small part of the solution. And so the second part is that we have to think about how university research remains vibrant. Sometimes when we say, oh, we need to find a better way to keep university research vibrant and relevant, is policymakers and commentators interpret this as make university research more applied, or sort of, and that means that's only a hop, skip, and a jump to who is the customer for your research. I think that would be a big mistake. I'm not a big fan of trying to convert universities into contract research shops, or of the periodic attempts to force relevance on scientists. For one reason, at a minimum, in order for that to happen, you've got to have a smart and capable partner on the other side, which means you need the established incumbent firms, established corporations, to have the absorptive capability to interact with the student, with the university researchers. Both mission-driven research and curiosity-driven research have their place, and even the most successful corporate lab always had to balance these two. But having said all of this, I think it's time when funders of the public that funds the university research and university professors that universities and university professors ought to be judged less by the number of papers they produce and more by the ideas they produce, less by the citations received and more by the impact achieved. Now, doing so is difficult, believe me, but it's not impossible. And we do need to try harder as to how we fund university research. One way might be to think of other mechanisms beyond just funding principal investigators, which is the predominant form, at least in America. One might think of things like block grants, as DARPA once did in developing computer science. So for those of you who don't know, for about 20 plus years, DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, gave dollops of money to selected universities to develop computer science. I was at Carnegie Mellon for 17 years. We were the happy beneficiary of this largesse. And essentially the money came as one chunk, no strings attached. Do what you wish with it. One reason that DARPA did this was it not only wanted to produce computer science, but also to produce computer scientists. If I showed you that chart, one of the big outputs of universities is the trained PhDs, and DARPA presciently recognized that and acted accordingly. What this also means more generally is I wonder if there's some way to reward the production of human capital, high-end skilled human capital, directly, rather than just be content with producing PhDs as a happy byproduct of research. In this respect, I wonder whether American universities, with their model of relying upon gifts from grateful and successful alumni, perhaps have an advantage. We understand this model better, both with our undergraduates and our PhDs. We understand that when they succeed, they will remember us in their wills, and they do, believe me. Now, I've talked about DARPA. A word of caution is in order. The legend of DARPA's successes has grown with every telling. It's important for us to understand why and when this is going to work. I don't have more to say on this other than to put this caveat that sort of the general lesson is we have to try a lot of things. That said, it seems fit and proper to try out different models of mission-oriented research, not just what DARPA is. I just this morning read of a nice example of Rockefeller's Foundation, which made a very early bet in the 1930s and 40s on molecular biology, which supported the work of people like Linus Pauling, Max Delbruck, and indirectly Watson of the Watson and Crick. Another example is Howard Hughes, that funds essentially people rather than projects. And now there are a number of ongoing experiments along these lines. For example, one such notable experiment was FAST Grants, which is an effort initiated by Emergent Ventures and Pat Collison, the founder of Stripe, the internet payment company. And there, what they did was they provided very rapid grants to efforts by university researchers to develop COVID tests cheaply and efficiently. Other foundations, Chan Zuckerberg, Simon, the Institute for Progress, they're all trying to experiment with how we should support and fund science and scientific research. It's early days. We don't understand what will work when, but I think it's a very promising start. The other part, just to go down this list, is governments can also affect the rate and direction of innovation, not just through their supply side policies, but through their demand side policies. Once again, think about the COVID-19 vaccine, Operation Warp Speed. We got a vaccine developed in about a third or less of the time than people said it would take. And this tells you that targeted demand policies can accomplish what they can accomplish when the scientific ground is fertile. Perhaps other similar efforts could be undertaken in sectors where the government is also a major user of innovation. Defense tech is an obvious one. The last thing I want to say is we also need to think a little bit about the VC model. The VC model seems to work really well in software and life sciences. And well, you all know the elements of the model. You have a 10-year fund, you're looking to make investments and to see the cash come back in less than 10 years. And that makes sense for certain types of ventures, but may not fit other types of sectors. And we need to think about ways to get private investors a return on their capital and the return of their capital, but without going into this kind of, cycle where companies are formed and they have to scale rapidly so that they can exit within the time windows. Now, this is a laundry list of remedies. I'm painfully aware of that. And the evidentiary basis for this list is thin. It's unsatisfactory, but it'll have to do for now. The problem at hand is a difficult one, and I suspect there is no silver bullets. But that ought not to deter us. We ought to try a number of approaches, each of which may only make a small, modest improvement, but together may make a dent in the problem. I'll conclude by saying the task of discovering efficient ways to translate scientific insights from universities into technical advances that eventually manifest in economic growth and productivity improvements and the advancement of our living standards is going to be absolutely crucial. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to invite Mr. Michael Edwards from Boeing Research and Technology to come up and make a few comments.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and I firstly want to make a special acknowledgement to Tom Spurling, the oration that is named tonight. Tom and I go back some way for working together back in CSIRO days, and with great respect, and a great friend over the many years. So it's a real honour to be here, Tom, and make some comments at the end of the lecture here. So many thanks, Beth, for the kind invitation to be part of the audience tonight to hear Professor Arora's very enlightening presentation, but also to provide some thoughts and reflections on his talk tonight. I'd also like to extend my welcome and gratitude to Professor Arora for making the long trip and sharing his insights into the evolving landscape of the US innovation system and how it may relate to, and no doubt impact, the shape of global ecosystems, including Australia's. It's been personally fascinating for me to read and listen to his observations and conclusions, given that I spent a very formative part of my early career in the late 1980s and early 90s working in one of this country's most famous corporate research labs at the so-called Central Research Laboratory, CRL, at Ascot Vale for ICI Australia. I can see Tom nodding and probably others in the room that are very familiar with CRL from ICI Australia. ICI CRL was first opened by Prime Minister Sir Robert Menzies in 1956, right in the heart of that era that you were talking about, Ashish, but eventually closed and sold off as residential housing land in 2003, exactly in line with your observations in the US, Ashish. I've also worked for 11 years of my career in CSIRO, and there's a number of CSIRO colleagues of mine in the room, including running the mission-directed National Flagships program in the late 2000s there. So have observed close hand how challenging, but also how effective it can be when focused government research can be directed towards specific industry and societal outcomes. And now, of course, I'm right in the demographic of Professor Arora's study domain as the lead of an industrial research team who form part of a global network of tech centres for a US-based multinational and its own journey to becoming what we would like to describe as a truly global research and engineering workforce, and I'll talk a bit more about that. After reading Professor Arora's chapter entitled The Changing Structure of American Innovation, some cautionary remarks for economic growth, from which the talk was largely based, written along with his other colleagues from Duke University and University of East Anglia, and from listening to the oration today, I find myself in part squirming in my chair at the data-driven truths presented, in part frowning with intrigue about whether, where and how it applies to me and my team, but also warmed in a way by the thought that some of the deliberate things we are doing here and hopefully addressing at least some of the cautionary remarks that he made. So let me discuss some brief thoughts around that. In his thought-provoking chapter, Professor Arora delves into the intricate dynamics of American innovation and its evolving structure. He quite meticulously examines the historical trajectory of innovation in the US, shedding light on its transformation over time and offering valuable insights into its implications for economic growth. One of the central themes of Professor Arora's chapter revolves around the shifting landscape of innovation ecosystems and research investments. He highlights how the traditional model of innovation, characterised by large corporations driving research and development within their confines, has undergone significant change. With the emergence of new actors and paradigms such as startups, venture capital, open innovation networks, the innovation ecosystem has become increasingly diverse and dynamic. That's a quick summary of the talk that you made very eloquently there. In particular, of note and interest for me, he studied the decreasing absolute amount of industry research by corporations in the research area, as you described, by corporations, and describes from data-driven observation, and I quote in his chapter, "The fundamental challenge of managing long-run research inside a for-profit corporation is a formidable one." Hence the squirm on my part. Of course, it's not lost to probably most in the room here that Australia's business enterprise R&D, or the BERD measure as we refer to it, and the intensity of R&D activities undertaken by business has been in decline here over the last 10 years at least at a national level, at least since the mining boom era, and marries with a decline in the industry value add to GDP for Australia over the same period. There's actually an excellent research note from just November last year, 2023, by Dr. Jeffrey Wilson from the Australian Industry Group, which provides a really easy to digest summary of these trends for anyone who might be interested to read more about that and look into it after Professor Arora's presentation of the US data tonight. So the cautionary tale of reduced or closed or redirected corporate innovation investment in the US is definitely relevant to our part of the world. Some of the other observations around increasingly short-term horizons for research, an imperative for industrial R&D investments to close around a business case, a related growth in the amount of business unit funding, my phrasing, that we rely on to deliver relevant technologies, or skin in the game, as we sometimes refer to it, within our business. The increasing trend of patent filings and proprietary information protection as opposed to corporate research publication, and the challenge of constantly ensuring that our technology developments are transitioning, as again we say internally, to support the growth or productivity or both of our businesses. All of those definitely apply in my world. Our CTO regularly reminds us that our investment in research is only creating value if it ultimately finds its way into our products and services. So yes, Ashish, a formidable challenge, and one that I live every day in keeping the long-term value of our research capability sold to the corporation. But the more I've digested the cautionary tales embedded in this study, I'm also warmed and comforted that some of our local strategies to mitigate and address these issues are at least on the right track, I believe. We have a very deliberate focus on disruption in quite specific technology areas that we are leading for the company. In other words, we're not trying to be all things to all people. We've embraced the development and deployment of digital and model-based systems engineering tools to address the cost and speed of tech transition. We work hard to foster long-term partnerships around key capabilities relevant to our research fields, as evidenced by partnerships such as CSIRO for Boeing that dates back nearly 35 years in Australia. And more recently, Swinburne University through the Air Hub program. Virginia and I were talking about that earlier tonight here in Melbourne, for example. And collaboration programs with our university partners across the country are also a deliberate investment in assuring our long-term talent pipeline in country. That comment you made about creating the computer scientists as DARPA's program is very much a mindset that we have with our university programs. So in these ways, I feel we're at least trying to break the fundamental premise in Professor Arora's study about the deepening division of innovative labour between industry and universities to the maximum degree possible. Additionally, by having our corporate R&D facility co-located with an engineering, design and manufacturing business here in Port Melbourne, we've established an end-to-end innovation ecosystem that is able to take disruptive technologies that we create internally with our collaborators as well, mature them in a controlled and rigorous way up through the technology readiness levels, which will be a phrase probably well known to many, deploy and production harden them right on the factory floor here in Melbourne, and then extend and replicate them across the broader enterprise to global operations. So given our circumstances here in Melbourne in particular, it has provided us with an almost unique opportunity within my company to create an innovation ecosystem that is able to rapidly transition new technologies right into our production system. A very different model to where I started in the central research laboratories of ICI Australia, but very successful for us in the mission-directed industrial research environment that I live in today. So overall, and in conclusion, Professor Arora's work provides a comprehensive and insightful analysis of the changing structure of American innovation and its implications for economic growth. By examining key trends, challenges and policy considerations, he clearly offers valuable guidance for policymakers, researchers and practitioners seeking to navigate the complexities of the innovation landscape in the 21st century. Thanks again for your insights that are definitely informative and very valuable for me at an individual and team level, but more importantly, perhaps to leaders from across our own national innovation system represented here in the audience tonight. Thanks so much again for the opportunity to comment, and back to you, Beth, for Q&A. Thank you.
Now I'd like to open the proceedings up to Q&A, question and answer from the audience. There's a few roving mics. Are there? Ashish and Michael, do you want to come up maybe? What's that here? Irene, do you want to? You've got the mics? No, I don't have. Here, I think. So that give it to Irene. Okay, who's going to go first?
Thank you. A question for Ashish. I was interested in your comments about using antitrust powers and skill in that kind of environment. And when I think about the things the Australian government's done, one of the things they've done in the last 12, 15 years is actually provide tax incentives to support private companies to invest in R&D, and they've made a distinction between large corporates and small corporates. But there's been a bit of debate in the last couple of years about whether those incentives are actually just funding incremental development and whether in fact the incentives should be swinging back towards making or only rewarding large corporates for investing in research rather than the D. And I'm interested in your views on that.
You're probably benefiting from such tax incentives.
Michael, do you want to?
I'm probably more familiar with the Australian story that you're talking about, and yes, we do benefit from it. It's interesting though. So the reality of how that works is that we have a claim against, you know, our holding company in Australia on an annual basis for the amount of research that we undertake, and that is beneficial, but it actually goes into consolidated revenue. So it doesn't come back to me as a budget for R&D. So it's that sort of perverse incentive in some regards. It doesn't change the way we think in any way about the types of areas that we're researching, the technologies and so forth. That is part of our sort of strategies that are set in our you know, research enterprise programs. So it's more a monetary benefit that's almost indirect, if that makes sense. And we take advantage of it for sure. But it doesn't really have that direct effect on, do we do more R&D, or in what areas do we doing it in? And I don't know if you've got a comment you'd like to make.
I'm just going to double down on that. My guess is that the amount of money that you could get as a tax incentive doesn't move the needle in terms of people like Michael making the case for some big new program. That has to come from the top. It has to be that there's somebody sitting at the board level, or at least this very senior leadership level, who is going to set the tone. The rest is, you know, yeah, they'll take advantage of it, but it won't change anything.
Yeah, can I, great talk, by the way, enjoyed that. Can I offer a counter view? In fact, the R&D tax incentive makes a huge difference, perhaps not to large companies, but to small companies, both private and on the ASX. Right? And we do a lot of work for those companies, and they would not be doing that work here if it wasn't, or some of them at least, if it wasn't for the R&D tax incentive.
Sure.
And for our own research, we would not be doing anywhere near as much work. We have 12 to 15 people if it wasn't for the R&D tax return. And that leads me to another comment, really. In terms of patents, you know, there's a difference between filed provisionals and granted patents. There is a huge difference how you count them, because there's an enormous number of provisionals, but in fact only a fraction of those get taken to actual patents and claims being granted. And so, you know, there's a nuance there as to how you evaluate those. And companies such as ourselves would not publish, even though we're doing a lot of R&D, and same with some of the ASX companies, because you want to keep those things in-house, secret. You actually put in the minimal amount you can in some of the patents, so others can't exploit those patents as much.
Agree, absolutely. I think I agree with everything you said, but the thrust of my remarks are that we need the big companies, not just the small ones. We've got the small ones, both here and in America. We need the big ones to step up. Put very crudely, that's it.
Professor, thank you for your oration, and it sort of encapsulates my 40 years of working in this space. I'm now retired, but I worked for Monsanto in the 80s and early 90s and was privileged to be involved in the development of glyphosate and then agricultural biotechnology and the people that developed that. And your description of the US innovation system at the corporate level was very appropriate. I then also worked in the first decade of this century in commercialising university technology and working with startups and venture capital sector, mainly in the life sciences sector. The one thing that strikes me in my experience is the ability to link discovery and innovation to something tangible in the marketplace. Now, you mentioned both mission and curiosity-driven research, and both have a place, but the thing that struck me with the innovations of Monsanto particularly was we were able to very clearly define the problem and the opportunity that the innovation would address. I had the privilege of meeting the inventor of glyphosate, John France, and he worked on a specification which was very much ahead of its time. It later became known in the pharmaceutical industry as rational drug design. taking the innovation ecosystem that you've described and all the problems that you've outlined, and they're all real, how do we continue now in this division of labour to ensure that we've got an accurate and specific definition of problems and opportunities that can feed back into this process? Because I feel that that linkage has somewhat been lost.
I'll take this person, Mark. I completely agree with you, and I think that's in the days of the corporate lab, that was kind of easier, that you could do stuff, but there was a clear target, and sometimes you did stuff and people found an application for it because they said, oh, we can use it here. And the example with Google sort of, exemplifies that. I don't know how to get it back in this new system with startups and which are going to live for 5, 7, 10 years. I'll let Michael sort of describe what he thinks.
Oh, look, I don't think I have a lot more to add. I think the way that at least at corporate research, and it's interesting to hear the Monsanto story, is we have most of our the work that we're doing is increasingly, let's say Horizon 2 toward Horizon 1. I gave examples, for example, of what we're doing here in Melbourne, where we're actually doing work that we can take deliberately into the factory and production harden it. So that is deliberately moving toward getting to high readiness level and very applied research activity. But then in the long life cycle, a long product life cycle of a company like Boeing, where the product life cycle is decades. And you gave examples. In fact, the 777 is a good example. We're doing a new 777 as we speak, which is in the mid 2020s from its first launch in 1990. That's a 30-year life cycle change. So each one of those changes, you have to make a pretty distinctive change for it to be an investment worth that many billions of dollars for the case to close. So the longer term focus is always on what is the most significant disruption that we can bring to reality and be confident of bringing to reality for the investment that we make, but actually then see it through that incremental maturity and de-risk it along the way, so that when you're actually launching something of that value, that you're super confident it's going to work.
Thank you for the the talk. It's, I guess, a bit depressing on our side of things, but I mean the big change that's happened for the first time in human history with advanced general AI, we've got the possibility of innovation not being human or increasingly non-human in the future. I was wondering if you could speculate on how that might turn around this decline or change things, phase change.
So I guess I'm going to come across as an aging boomer on this one. I'm not convinced that this is what it's touted to be. When electricity first came on the scene in the early 1900s, there were all sorts of advertisements you could see. Cure cancer with electricity, electromagnetism for this. A lot of this open AI hype sounds to me like that. I think the case remains to be made. And it's going to be very difficult. Well, it's going to be just as challenging to find where we can use AI and GPT type stuff. So I'm skeptical that we will see the benefits of this. Specifically, the 2 or 3 papers I've seen that talk about using artificial intelligence for discovery, for example, new molecules. There was a paper published, I think, in Science or Nature. A careful study shows the following. The things that are true are not new. So the things that they discovered that actually those materials are what they claim, those we've known. And the stuff that's new is not true. So it's a little bit like the Soviet Union used to be. So what's news is not true, and what's true is not news.
Thank you both for the fantastic presentations. It's a very interesting perspective that I haven't seen in the literature. So it's really good to hear that. And I was wondering if you have considered the influence of communication technologies and access to information, because I think in the last 50 years it has changed a lot, and it takes a few seconds to access scientific publications almost anywhere on the globe. And that also makes it more risky to companies to leverage some of those papers that they do not have legal protection on. So I was wondering if that could be affecting how willing companies are to exploit those new discoveries to create new products, knowing that if they're publicly available, like other companies will also leverage that. So they are only relying on patents and licenses for developing new products and services. Have you thought like about something similar?
So let me first acknowledge that I think it's right. Companies do think about when they want to make an investment as to how they're going to recover that investment. I'm skeptical about that open publication is deterring companies from using, from applying this knowledge. Much of what you see in papers is a long distance away from commercially useful products and services. I'll also make another contrarian remark. Every generation thinks that they're special, and this generation thinks that way. When synthetic dyes were first discovered, Perkins Mauve in the 1850s, within 6 years, organic dyestuffs will be produced on the continent. I remind you, 1850s. That's how quickly, when there's useful knowledge, it will move quickly, and even 200, almost, well, not quite 200 years, but almost that, it moved. So I'm not convinced that this information revolution, in terms of what you're talking about, has been all that dramatic in terms of changing the speed with people are learning about new things.
First of all, I'll agree with all the comments and trends that have been observed today. There's definitely, in our world, there's a tightening of the communication externally, proprietary information. It is very easy to inadvertently give away something that is, critical technical information to competitors. So we're very conscious of that, probably overly conscious, to be fair. But a different twist on the question is a very, very significant new investment in the digital tools and model-based engineering. I made brief reference to. It's not the same as sort of, search and communications that you described, but we certainly are changing, I think, to be much more reliant up front in our research and in our design thinking of doing as much as we can, particularly on the engineering front, digitally, proving it down, and then being able to sort of reinforce or validate in the physical world. In fact, just to carry on with the discussion on that front just for a minute, the former chief engineer or CTO of our company, Greg Heislop, just retired late last year. He gives the example of the 787, Boeing 787, which was quite a disruptive play for our company, all composite aircraft wing and fuselage, so very, very different manufacturing system that we'd never really knew and had done before. So the very first airplane that we made, line number one, it's what we call line one of the 787, was probably the hardest we made, the most expensive airplane that we ever built. Of now, what is about 1,400 787s. And then of course you come down the cost curve. And at about line 100, you've learned a lot about the production system, refining and so forth. His thesis is we've got to do line 1 to 100 in the digital world. And we make the first physical model that we make is actually line 101. And you've learned all that and come down the cost curve through that. And that's the sort of ethos that we've got internally now around lots of our engineering development. Slightly different twist on your question, but it's a big deal for us.
Thank you very much, Professor Arora. Just a slightly different angle, and that is you talked a lot in your comments on investment in human capital and innovative capacity about producing PhDs. So I'm wondering, you're in the university in the PhD supply side. So PhDs, has the model stood the test of time, and will it continue to do so?
Sorry, can you say a little bit more?
Well, you talk a lot about the investment
Right.
and carrying out research in universities, and a major output measure that you use is the production of PhDs. So in the whole innovative ecosystem, if you will, producing PhDs and that model, is that still a successful model, and will it continue to be so?
I think in the American context, I would say yes. And then probably if we talked more, I would find occasion to qualify my unequivocal yes. But I think it's clear that this is an important part of what we do and is an under-rewarded part of what we do. So what we as university professors do. And so I'm not sure how I would change the reward structure, but it's certainly something we should be more cognizant of.
I think I'll make one additional comment that, and there's many in the room that know this. You know, I personally think we've got to have a lot more industry-aligned PhDs, and certainly we're trying to do, you know, from our little knothole, we're trying to do more of that to actually do very focused projects that are industry relevant. That we want to take an industry, we want to take an interest, as it were, in the project activity that is being done under the PhD, and ultimately have those PhDs come and join us for the long-term career that they can have in a company like ours.
So we've got time for one more question in the middle of it.
Hello, that was a really interesting talk. I just found that you made this very large distinction between research and development and R&D. And would you agree that the term R&D has become so synonymous with every company now that we forget that it is two things, it's research and development? And so when we have these tax breaks for research and development, as you said for Boeing, that money doesn't go into research and technologies, it goes rather into the company itself developing it. So in that sense, should policy and future decisions around how we reward this research be spread between and a solid distinction between research? Like, you get this tax break because you researched stuff, rather than you get this tax break because you did development.
So I think there are two problems with it. One is defining what's R and what's D in the particular is difficult. You know, so it's on average, most reasonable people could agree on most cases, but the difficult ones are always going to be on the border. And second, I would repeat, I think there's a case for small companies, and for that, I think it's a good idea to encourage that activity. For big companies, I think that's not going to be enough. I think we need something more, and antitrust forbearance is something that CEOs understand. If your company is going to get broken up, right? If Google, search is going to be broken off from the rest of Google, YouTube, that gets the CEO's attention very quickly. That's an existential threat to the company. I'm not suggesting we do that. I'm simply saying, if you want companies to change, you've got to find something that rises to that level. A small few million to Google is not going to change anybody's decision making.
I'd now like to invite our Associate Professor Alphonse Palancanrea to say a few words of thanks.
Thank you, Beth. I'm Associate Professor Alphonse Palancanrea, and I'm the Deputy Director to the Center for Transformative Innovations. So I would like, on behalf of the center as well as Swinburne University, I would like to extend my heartfelt thank you to Professor Ashish Arora for making the long trips to Melbourne and for sharing all his knowledge in a very entertaining, inspiring, and enlightening presentations on the topic of very dear to us at the center as well as a whole of Swinburne universities. That we need to be cautious with the potential worrying trend in the background between investment in R&D and economic prosperities, and that one way to try to solve the issue is actually to have a better understanding on how the increasingly deficient labor of the innovative labor is organized. And for your excellent presentations and your sharing of your knowledge in the past 3 days, we have a small token of appreciation. It's probably not very high in terms of dollar value, but it is truly represent our heartfelt thank you very much. Also, I would like to extend a similar heartfelt thanks to Mr. Michael Edwards for his discussion presentations, and in particular for sharing his real corporate world experience on some of the mitigation strategies that Boeing has implemented to battle some of the cautionary tales that was raised by Professor Arora. And I also like to give to you, Michael, a token of appreciation. Thanks also for Professor Virginia Kilgorn, who been generously participating in this evening's opening the Spurling Orations on the absence of our Vice Chancellor as well as our Deputy Vice Chancellors, as both of them are unable to come tonight. And last but not least, I'd like to thank all of you, the wonderful audience, for these orations. Thank you for joining us to enjoy this enlightening and wonderful presentation from Professor Arora, and a very interesting discussions from Mr. Edwards. And I'd like now to offer you an invitation to join us in the Sky Lounge outside for some canapé and networking. Thank you very much and have a good evening.